So, Krystal Ball was invited onto Briahna Joy Gray's podcast, Bad Faith, to talk about the prospect of a leftist challenger to Joe Biden in the 2024 Democratic primaries. And I think in this interview, Krystal reveals herself for who she really is and who she really operates on behalf. So let's take a look.
Yeah. There was a little media cycle a month or so ago about, is Bernie going to run? I mean, for obvious reasons, I think that's not going to happen. But there does seem to be an appetite by people who are politically disaffected for someone to run outside of Joe Biden, in addition to Joe Biden. And my concern is that given all of the fractures that we've seen on the left since Bernie dropped out in 2020, whether it's about force to vote or any of these force to vote adjacent skirmishes that have happened since then, that there's not a guarantee that any candidate, even if they're running against Joe Biden, who's obviously to the right of anybody a progressive would even consider voting for, any progressive that announced at this point would not have the guarantee of full-throated support from the left the way that Bernie did in 2016 and 2020. And I look at someone like Marianne and I see how the alliances that have happened would pick at various aspects of her foreign policy stance, would have issues with some of the, statements she's made about various public officials that have died, a certain approach to certain kind of Silicon Valley types that, she might have a personal knowledge or relationship with. And there are some people who say, well, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. She's obviously so superior to Joe Biden that I can overlook any number of things. And there's other people who have been burned so badly who look to someone like Nina Turner and think, well, she tried twice her way. She didn't learn a lesson about how to break free of the Democratic Party. They feel that she bent her knee on certain policy issues and certain messaging issues that speak to how she would also legislate if she were to win, and therefore are more distrustful than they would have been immediately in the wake of Bernie Sanders. And I wonder, do you think that is something that is surmountable?
So I think it is a real risk. I mean, with regard to Nina, just because I love her, I have to stand up for her and say, I think the idea, which has been floated, that if she ran third party.
Yeah, Krystal loves her so much, doesn't she?
She would have had a better chance in this district is ludicrous. I mean, this was a district that likes Democrats. And actually the biggest problem for her, especially in her first run when she came a lot closer, was her
I'm sorry, Krystal. No one likes Democrats. I mean, in regard to this, you heard, so Briahna Joy Gray was pointing out how certain people wouldn't like the idea of Nina Turner running because they're rightfully not trustful of the Democratic Party. And you could hear how biased Krystal was in that interview. She said she loves Nina Turner. Later on, she says that she's a warrior. A warrior? Like, give me a break. She smeared Jimmy Dore for speaking the truth about how the FBI was treating Donald Trump. Like, back in the 60s, people who were supposed to be on the left were actually against the FBI. These fake leftists we have these days, Fred Hampton is rolling in his grave looking at these people. So, anyway, in regard to the idea of a leftist challenging Joe Biden in the 2024 Democratic primaries, I'm skeptical that the idea of running as a Democrat is gonna work. I mean, Bernie ran twice. He inspired a lot of people, but ever since Bernie endorsed Biden hasn't done anything. He said he'd support a $15 minimum wage, and he hasn't. He said he'd do a public option for healthcare, but he hasn't. And the entire Democratic Party has abandoned their progressive promises that they've made. The squad doesn't want to take a stand on anything. They didn't want to take a stand on force to vote. They didn't want to take a stand on the Build Back Better legislation as it was being watered down. They didn't want to. Pramila Jayapal just let it get decoupled from the bipartisan legislation. They didn't want to take a stand on sending $40 billion to Ukraine on behalf of Ukraine Azov Battalion neo-Nazis and NATO. They didn't want to take a stand on vaccine mandates, and that's why I don't think a leftist primary challenger will be able to motivate people like Bernie did. This is why we need to say no to the Democratic Party. This is why we need to say no to the two-party system. This is why we need a third-party candidate. This is why we need direct action. This is why we need to organize and take to the streets. And that's how we're going to achieve revolution. So there you have it.